think for a lot of people, when they think about, well, what skills do you need in the apocalypse, they do immediately sort of turn to like, oh, I need to have a bunker and guns or whatever. But actually, the most important thing for handling disasters is to be ready to cooperate, to have a good social network, to build trust, to build community.
Hello, everybody. It is I, Ruhamah the Kombucha Mamma, and I am thrilled to welcome today Athena Aktipis, who has written a really amazing book. Let's see the book. Woo, A Field Guide to the Apocalypse. Oh my gosh, you guys, did you notice we're living in really challenging times? Well, Athena has a guide for you. And we know each other because we work together on kombucha research projects through Arizona State University. So before we dive into the kombucha part of how and why we know each other, plus it's in the book, let's first hear about you and why do you care about the apocalypse and zombies? Tell us what's going on.
Well, I care about the apocalypse because, we don't want the end of the world to come without us putting up a fight, right? And so, all of us have kind of like noticed that things are they're getting real, right? I mean, we had a pandemic that was pretty apocalyptic. There's wildfires, we're coming up onto wildfire season now. And all over the world, people deal with apocalypses, war, and civil unrest and things like that. So it's not like the apocalypse is some imaginary idea. It's real. And if you think about the apocalypse not as like the end of the world, but rather as like the ancient Greek definition, which is a revelation of, what the world really is, then all of these events that are happening, like they tell us like, hey, this is what the world is really like. This is what the risk is that we are all facing. And it's an opportunity to learn and figure out how we can do a better job of being resilient when the shit does hit the fan.
Well, and I like that you qualify this definition of apocalypse, because I think when a lot of people hear that term, they think the end of the world. And having grown up with parents who were raised in a cult church, who were end times are near folks, right? So we've been expecting the end of the world for decades, and it has yet to materialize. And I would posit we're seeing the end of the world every single day for these reasons you're talking about. I mean, things are dying and transitioning and changing constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love that you're talking about this is the like rending of the veil so that we can see what's really going on. And I think that gives us a little more hope, because I feel like those of us who are on the planet right now, we're the descendants of the people who survived many apocalypses.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that means that we have the ability to survive this one, but perhaps we need some guidance and tools. So what are the types of things you're talking? Is it like building a bunker? What are the types of skills you're offering in this book?
Well, I think for a lot of people, when they think about, well, what skills do you need in the apocalypse, they do immediately sort of turn to like, oh, I need to have a bunker and guns or whatever. But actually, the most important thing for handling disasters is to be ready to cooperate, to have a good social network, to build trust, to build community, and to, have a lifestyle like before the apocalypse comes that helps you like actually enjoy the process of being prepared and ready, and not have it be something that like has to be a complete distraction from your life, but that it's actually kind of built in to how you live your life. And so the book, part of it is about exactly what you were saying a few minutes ago, that we really are adapted for the apocalypse because our ancestors have been dealing with challenges from the beginning of humanity. For our hunter-gatherer ancestors during human evolution, they were experiencing major disasters like during a lifetime. So, 20 to 25% of your group would probably die from some sort of apocalyptic event. So that's a lot of apocalypses. And that is a lot of time for evolution to actually favor in us various abilities to be resilient to the apocalypse. And that includes our ability to cooperate, our abilities to communicate and coordinate, and the way that we build community and help each other in times of need. That's also something that I studied a lot, and I talk about that in this book quite a bit. How we see across small scale societies that when things get real, when either people or households experience disasters or whole communities experience disasters, that there is this pattern of need-based helping. So when people are in need, they will ask for help, and then they receive help. People help based on being asked and able to help without expecting to get paid back, when it happens in this sort of context of a disaster. So it's really exciting to see that, that's actually very fundamental to our humanity. And then it's something that we can leverage for how we prepare for and deal with disasters in modern Western market integrated societies too.
Well, so what is your background? Is it anthropology? What got you onto this whole stream of thought? And I just want to acknowledge that I absolutely love what you're talking about, because this is right. I call this, we got to SCOBY up. We got to come together. Those of us who love kombucha know what I'm talking about here. We got to come together, this bacteria and yeast, and create this healthy, diverse community that can, survive through these challenging times. So I'm really resonating with this message. And I want to share with people how you came to this understanding as well through your work. So what is your work?
Yeah, so I study cooperation across all systems. So I work, on how humans cooperate. I work on how cells in our body cooperate. And I also work on kombucha and how yeast and bacteria cooperate in kombucha to make a more resilient community. And so my interest is sort of, how does cooperation work, like in general? What are the things that can, challenge it or compromise it? And then how do systems evolve to control that cheating or deal with it or thrive in spite of it? So that's really where my interest in these topics came from and what the book grew out of.
And what did you find in your research? Are people just like the microbes in a SCOBY? Obviously we couldn't live without them. And so we're already a SCOBY just in our human bodies because we're collaborating with all of the microbes that are within us. But I'm curious, how did this research then play out in terms of how many similarities, differences?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of interesting parallels. So for example, that the larger groups get, whether you're talking about human groups or cellular societies, the more challenging it can be to make cooperation work. Not just because there's more individuals who could cheat or exploit, but it might be easier for them to go undetected if the group is really big. And there's also a lot more resources to exploit if you have a bigger group. So, right, there's more of an incentive there. So group size can be a challenge. But in a lot of systems, you see that there are mechanisms for, regulating cheating, for detecting it if it happens, for limiting it. And so that's part of why large scale cooperation is viable, is because you actually get the sort of regulation of, detecting and regulating cheating. And I love studying kombucha because it's a reminder that you can have cooperation between entities that are completely, unrelated to each other, different, kingdoms even, right? It's pretty amazing. And it keeps my mind fresh and sharp about, thinking about general principles of cooperation, because at least in the world of sort of the academic study of cooperation, there's a sort of bias, I think, to think that you can really only get cooperation among relatives, or only get cooperation if there's a guaranteed payback if you're going to help. And I think one of the really cool things about kombucha is that the cooperation is like super complicated, and we're still kind of trying to figure out exactly what is happening during the metabolic processes that keep the cooperation stable in kombucha, because it seems to be very, very stable. And and so I have a graduate student, Giselle. You've met Giselle, and we're working right now on trying to sort of unravel, like, how does kombucha deal with the potential cheaters, the potential, microbes that might come in and consume the sugars and compromise it, right? Which should have a lot of, I think, general interesting implications, but also specific ones for brewing kombucha, because, you don't want it to get invaded. So,
well, and I really do think of the kombucha culture as a metaphor for the world, because I think, yes, we have a theory of evolution, and out of that came, we elevated the concept of survival of the fittest. And it's not that that doesn't exist. And the vast majority of the ecosystem of the world is in cooperation.
Well, and the idea of survival of the fittest, it never actually meant that only the strongest survive. It actually means survival of those that fit best in their environment and ecology, which is very, very different from like, oh, it's just the best, you got to be the best, otherwise you're out. So I think, there's been a sort of, miscommunication and misinterpretation of what the theory of evolution does mean for cooperation. And the more you really look at like the evolutionary biology behind cooperation, the more you see that cooperation is actually like unbelievably successful in the natural world, and that it's not that hard to get it to evolve if you just have sort of simple mechanisms for cooperators to preferentially interact with other cooperators. It's called positive assortment, which is kind of like a nerdy phrase, but it really just means that like anytime cooperators interact more with cooperators than would be expected at random, then you're able to get cooperators then get the benefits of cooperation, and that makes cooperation more viable. So, hang out with nice people, basically.
Well, and it's so true. Like the environment you put yourself in. I mean, there's so many adages. One rotten apple spoils the bunch. And, part of why that happens is if you are hanging out with unsavory elements, well, you're going to end up in unsavory situations.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is why your parents always said, make sure you're hanging out with the right types of people.
Well, and if you dip the apple in kombucha ahead of time, it'll be less likely to rot, right? So
exactly right. Well, and that's what I wonder is what in our society now favors cooperators, like from a, human Western perspective.
Well, if you sort of think about if something happened to you that was a personal disaster, like there's probably people who would be like, oh, I'd call this person or this person, right? So we all kind of have these networks of mutual aid, people we know we can rely on. And those really exist outside of the market-based system, right? It's like the people who you're thinking of, if they helped you, they probably wouldn't be expecting you to like pay them back for their time, right? Like next month or something, right? Like, I mean, maybe if something bad happened to them, they'd hope that you would help if you could, but it's not a market-based exchange in that kind of situation.
Right. It's not transactional. It's,
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. And so all of that's, that's going on. It's just, we don't have sort of a formal way that is kind of appreciated and cultivated in our society, versus a lot of small scale societies where they like have a word for it, like the Maasai in East Africa. They have this system of helping each other, and they call it osotwa. So, we studied this for quite a while with the Human Generosity Project, and we saw, this with the Maasai in Fiji. They have a system called Keri Keri. In Uganda, the Ik people, they have a system they call Tamor Marang. Even in rural Arizona here, in southern Arizona, southern New Mexico, there's ranchers that live, many, many miles away from each other. So it can take like 45 minutes or an hour to drive to your neighbor's house. And they're, doing challenging work of, trying to run a ranch. And if something unexpected happens, somebody gets, injured or ill, or there's some sort of an accident or equipment failure, they will help each other without expecting to get paid back. And they call that neighboring. So it's something that in smaller scale societies is talked about more explicitly. It's often a part of the culture that people really recognize. But, it happens a little less formally, I think, for most of us that are, living in a more market integrated Western kind of context where we're, more urban living and all of that. I think, the more rural areas, like, you still have things like neighboring and related ideas where people are explicitly talking about that.
Well, even thinking about in the Middle East, you always offer the guest hospitality, right? So like how people interact from a hospitality perspective, there's cultural norms. And I think what happened here in the United States is we're kind of like this giant petri dish that didn't have these deep rooted cultural norms. And we've been able to, for better or worse, create our own sort of society out of nothing, if you will, or out of this agglomeration of cultures. And like you said, in smaller communities, we still have a lot of neighboring, and even in a large city, if you live in a certain area. I've lived in my neighborhood for 5 years, and I'm still just barely getting to know my neighbors.
Wow.
And mostly that's because I have a dog and I'm walking around in the neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
And so I think in our modern world, like, we do a lot of our neighboring or communities online. And to what extent that online community is the same as, is different from, replaces, mirrors, mimics, right? Like all those different aspects of it is really fascinating, because like we've seen the rise of a GoFundMe. So somebody gets injured, or there's a disaster, and there's a call for people to all pitch in, and random strangers who might not know you at all, but your story resonates with them, will just show up and, donate, not expecting anything in return. So it's fascinating to see how it does and doesn't exist in these virtual as well as localized areas.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what are so what I'm hearing you say is the way to survive the apocalypse is to have a community. Like that would be maybe the number one thing to do.
Yeah. Cultivate cooperation, build that community. And then, start thinking about, well, how can I manage my own risk? How can I make sure that I have like a shelter in place kit, so that if I, like if we have another pandemic like COVID, imagine that happens. Well, if everybody has a shelter in place kit, so you've got everything you need in your house for 72 hours, that you can stay home, you've got, all of your supplies, food, water ready, then it will be much easier to deal with the bigger threat, right? Because the governmental resources that are available can actually go towards dealing with the threat itself, instead of trying to deal with the humanitarian crisis that results. And also, people will be able to be much safer if they can stay home for 3 days, right? So there are, I think, a lot of layers of how to be ready. Having a community where people know each other and are ready to help each other is where it kind of all begins. And then you can sort of start thinking about, okay, well, how can I manage my own risk so that I can be a good member of the community that I'm in, right? And then how can you help others who might, not be as fortunate as you in terms of being able to afford to put together, their preparations for, being able to shelter in place. Having a go bag is also a good idea. There's certain kinds of disasters where you do need to leave. So, thinking about all of those layers. Also, like in your car, you should have a kit. So if your car breaks down, a lot of people already have some stuff in their car, right, for emergencies, but being more purposeful and deliberate about that. And to me, honestly, this, being prepared for disasters has really kind of become like a fun lifestyle choice, so it doesn't have to just be like, oh, I have to, sit down and do all of these things and it's a chore. But, rather you could kind of tie it into like having a sense of adventure, imagining like, okay, like if this was a zombie apocalypse, would I be able to survive? Do I have the things I need? And making it kind of fun. Certainly, I like to go on road trips. And so making sure I have what I need in my car. And then actually, if you're on the road enough, like you get to use that stuff and you're like, oh, okay, it actually is really useful having those things. I also have like a little kit that I take with me when I go hiking or cross country skiing somewhere, where I know I'm going to be out in the wilderness or kayaking, so that the, kinds of emergencies that might arise or like small injuries or issues that like I've got a kit to deal with whatever might happen to me or the people I'm with. And I actually really enjoy getting to use that because it's like, okay, I'm like putting myself out in the world, having some adventures, and it empowers you to feel like, okay, I can take some more risks with being adventuresome if I have managed my risk a little bit in terms of like having what I need. So yeah, I really like to think about being ready for the apocalypse not as something that has to be a downer, but something that can just be like a fun thing to integrate into the way, your outlook and your approach to life, and make you feel a little bit more like life is an adventure and that's okay.
And that's a more empowering perspective than I am waiting for this cataclysmic event to occur, at which point, it's going to turn into Mad Max, right?
Yeah,
it's going to, all of a sudden, we're going to be in this post-apocalyptic world where everyone's back to, guns and fighting over resources.
Exactly.
And, when have we ever stopped that is maybe the first question.
Yeah. Well, and I use this acronym in my book of CHESS, CHESS, for the things that I think are like much more important for surviving the apocalypse than, any things that you could be hoarding in your house. So curiosity, having a sense of curiosity about your world, your environment, what's the nature of the threats that you do face where you live, and really approaching that from a perspective of like, how can I learn about it and have fun learning about it. H for humor. So having a good sense of humor, being able to laugh at your own mistakes, or laugh at like the silliness of a situation that you got yourself into, or that, befell you because of things beyond your control. Being able to see the humor in things, I think, is really important. E for entertainment. So I think to the extent that we can have fun while, being entertained, if it's like a movie, right, about the apocalypse, or fun songs about, how to survive, or bad things that have happened, right? Like making it fun and entertaining, I think is really important, which relates to the first S of storytelling. So I think we really get drawn into stories about disasters and, personal stories of survival and resilience, or of mistakes that were made that could have cost you life and limb. Like those things are really compelling. And then finally, the final S for socializing, building a community and sharing information and help, and, enjoying being part of a community where you can do all of those things together of, being curious and having a sense of humor and telling stories and having fun around the apocalypse.
Well, this just sounds like a great recipe for life.
Yeah, totally. Well, and that's why I decided, instead of like doing a standard book tour, we're doing the Apocalypse Roadshow, which is basically a traveling variety show about how to survive the apocalypse, where we're going to different cities all along Route 66 for the next 6 months or so. And we're talking about, how you survive with sort of basic knowledge about prepping, but also talking about cooperation. And we have music as part of it. We have comedy. We have sketches. We have storytelling, and we're drawing both from sort of people who are part of the Apocalypse Roadshow team, and then people in the local community to sort of come out and, build like a show that is unique in every city. And, that will build community in the process. So that's the goal, is, for the tour to kind of be an embodiment of a lot of the principles.
Well, that sounds like a lot of fun. If we wanted to attend one of these Apocalypse Roadshows, where would we go to get those details?
Well, so we're at apocalypseroadshow.com. All of our future shows are up there. And we have a pretty poppin' Instagram. We're just Apocalypse Roadshow on Instagram, and also on Facebook. So you can find us on there for sure. And yeah, we have shows in LA and Flagstaff and Albuquerque. And then we'll be in Oklahoma and Texas and Missouri and Chicago, like all over the next 6 months.
So we heard how kombucha embodies a cooperative system. Where does kombucha fit into the apocalypse?
Oh, where does it fit in the apocalypse? Well, so I like wrote a whole page about like kombucha in my book. So here we go. There we are. Kombucha, including like some of my little favorite tips. So why kombucha in the apocalypse? Well, fermenting stuff is fun. It's good for you, but it also is like a really nice way to kind of invest in having a kitchen that is ready for all sorts of challenges. In general, fermenting things like adds a lot of nutritional value. And so if you're good, if you practice your fermenting skills in advance of any sort of apocalyptic event, then you'll have some skills that allow you to create more, nutritionally rich foods out of whatever foods you have available. So, there's benefits now, and there's benefits for, if you do have a disaster where you have to kind of hunker down and you don't have the opportunity to, get fresh food as much, for example.
Or like fresh water. I feel like,
Oh, absolutely.
Vinegar. And then the experiments you did, because you've also hosted like a zombie show. What?
Yeah. So
gathering.
Yeah. So I'm the executive producer of Zombified Media. We're an educational media company. We do events. The Zombified podcast. I've got some of the covers from my podcast up. And we've had,
that was your NFT collection.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So we've got this conference, the Zombie Apocalypse Medicine Meeting, that we have been holding for, a long time. We've had, how many have we had? We have had so many of them already. I guess 4.
Well, it's every other year. Is that right? It's
every other year. Yeah. But it's been going on for a while. We had 2 in person at ASU. And then, we had 1 in person at ASU, and then we had 1 online, and then another 1 in person. And now we're planning for the 4th one, which is going to be in Eureka Springs as a sort of blowout after the first leg of the Apocalypse Roadshow, our Route 66. And yeah, so that's going to be in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, right before the Zombie Crawl and horror film festival that's happening there. So if you're looking for
Halloween, when is that?
Yeah, right before Halloween. So it's going to be pretty amazing. But yeah, so I think you were asking about kombucha.
Well, I brought it up because you guys did a really neat experiment with petri dishes and kombucha in people's hands.
Yes. Yeah. And in fact, Giselle, who is my grad student who's working on kombucha right now, she did a whole set in the Apocalypse Roadshow in our variety show about kombucha and how kombucha is quite resilient to the apocalypse of getting a bunch of hand swabs from random people's hands introduced to it, which is the experiment that we did, a citizen science experiment where we had people swab their hands, and then we put those swabs into kombucha, and into sweet tea that didn't have kombucha starter in it. So, and then we let those grow for 30 days, and we sequenced them, before and after. And essentially, what we found is that the kombucha community was quite resilient. The composition of yeast and bacteria stayed very stable, and it looked quite healthy. There was a SCOBY on top at the end of those 30 days, versus the tea without the kombucha starter in it, which looked disgusting, frankly.
Probably looked like a zombie.
Yeah, it was gross. And the sequencing that we did showed that, indeed it was not a, diverse, stable kombucha community, but rather was dominated by a few bad actors. So, yeah.
And this is I think so telling. And this is another reason I have kombucha at home, right? Because it's also a great cleaning fluid.
Yeah, like vinegar. Yeah.
It's such a wonderful preservative in so many ways. And I love what you're saying about the resilience of the community and its ability to, even when purposefully contaminated, will eliminate pathogens and bad actors because of the stability of the community. And I think your research even showed that the SCOBY itself, the pellicle, is like the immune system of the culture. There's been this sort of in the various online places, people are like, the SCOBY's a byproduct, throw it away, it's just garbage. And I'm like, are your tonsils garbage? Is your appendix garbage? Just because we don't understand something doesn't mean that it's not intended to be there. I always feel like nature doesn't make mistakes. Nature knows what she's doing, and if it's there for a reason. And
yeah,
so,
that's our hypothesis, is that the SCOBY and in general the sort of production of cellulose is part of what we think is kind of like a collective immune system in kombucha. We're in the process of testing that idea. We've done some studies to look at, like, do you get a larger SCOBY if you introduce pathogens. And what we've seen so far is consistent with that hypothesis, but there's more work to do to really show that. But even just the idea that there could be a multi-species immune system that could exist is not something that people have been thinking about in the scientific community. So we have to be a little cautious about, like, making sure that we're doing the studies as thoroughly as possible to, like, really definitively show that it is functioning in ways that people agree, like, map onto what an immune system does. But yeah, to me, that's kind of what it looks like based on what we've seen so far.
I love that. And I think, talk about multi-species immune system. Isn't that what lives inside of us, essentially?
Yeah, to the extent that, like, the microbes that reside in and on us, like, they do have an important function in helping to, sort of take up the ecological niches in our bodies so that other, pathogens don't come in. And they probably are competing even more directly with those pathogens, and so I think you're absolutely right that, like, there needs to be a sort of reframing even of what an immune system is, and that it's not necessarily just something that resides, like, in the, it's coded in the genes of the, organism that has it, right? That it could be this more distributed kind of thing. And yeah, it's one of the things that I'm very excited about now.
I can tell.
Thinking about that. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, this is, and this, again, the metaphors, a lot of my information about, obviously I read the studies, I'm very passionate about the research, and I drink it. And I also feel like there's this DNA wisdom inside of us. Like, there's so much information encapsulated in every single cell of our body. And it's how do we tap into that information? I feel like kombucha is something that, for me, has allowed me to get back in touch with my intuition, to really trust my gut. And I say trust your gut with a big U, like, you do what makes, you got to trust your own intuition at the end of the day, not just follow what somebody else is prescribing or saying works for them. And I don't know. I feel like your hypotheses really resonate with me. And I feel like they percolate up these bubbles of information, because I feel like this is how science works. Is, in fact, so much of what we end up studying is because we dreamt about it, or
Mhm.
we had an intuition about it, because
Yeah.
sci is knowledge, right? And scientific method is a process to test hypotheses, like you said. And how do we even get the inspiration for that? Well, it's just by existing, observing, being, it's chess, right? It's being curious,
Mhm.
and wanting
Yeah.
to tell stories
Yeah.
about things that we're experiencing and seeing in the world around us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've nailed it, This sort of combination of observing, really like looking at what you're seeing and then having a sense of imagination, right? Being able to say like, "Oh, well, maybe this is because of this." Like you need to be able to do that to come up with the hypothesis in the first place.
Mhm.
And even this idea that like the SCOBY could be functioning as a sort of immune system, that came from unexpected things that were happening in studies that I was doing with a student who was working with me a while ago, Shri, who you also met, where he was just a very, very careful observer. And he said, Athena, it not only looks like, that with this experiment that we did that I was telling you about with the hand swabs, not only does it look like there's a sort of normal SCOBY, like it looks better. It seems like it's thicker or like nicer, and he's like, look a little harder at this. And I looked a little harder at it and I was like, you're right. Like, even though we weren't hypothesizing that, right? It was something that he noticed in the studies that we were doing. And so then that allowed us to say, okay, well, how can we go back and more explicitly test this hypothesis that the sort of introduction of these challenges could be spurring on the production of the SCOBY, like you might expect with an immune response.
Which is exciting because, okay, from a home brewer perspective, not a commercial perspective. In commercial brewing, we have to follow sanitary regulations, etc. But as a home brewer, I like to touch my cultures. I
Mhm.
like to put yes, I wash my hands.
Yeah.
But I like to be hands-on with my cultures,
Yeah.
and I feel like that imbues something into them. And what I'm hearing you say is it does, and potentially causes it to be healthier and more robust as a result, because I'm potentially introducing things that might be harmful, and the system then has a chance to respond to that and thereby improve itself or strengthen itself, just like an immune system would, as it's exposed to things it needs to respond to.
Potentially. I mean, I can't say like, hey, go and like put a bunch of junk in your right, because and like we weren't drinking it after, right? We were just
Right.
sort of like once we put the kombucha in the lab, like it stays in the lab. Like
Yeah.
we don't drink it at all. Would I drink the kombucha that came from the hand swab experiment myself? I don't think I would, because that
I
was
don't think
like
I would either.
like
I don't think I'm brave enough.
Phoenix like coming and putting their hand swabs in there, even though it looks fine. I mean, if like if it was the only thing to drink in an apocalypse, maybe I would then. But like honestly, like I would say, it probably, you know,
Well,
I
I'll
mean,
help you out here. There
yeah,
was a study that showed anthrax grew in kombucha. Well, they happened to be brewing it in a barn next to cows that had anthrax. So it's not impervious, right? It's not like
yeah,
a superhero where it's gonna, kill anything and everything in its path. So it can be invaded if it's in the wrong type of environment.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think more the point I'm making is that as people who know our own sanitation habits and we're
yes,
washing our hands, we don't
yeah,
have to be so afraid,
yes,
because we know we're
that's
consuming
right.
it for ourselves. We're not selling
Mhm.
it to the general public, and we get to create that personal relationship with it.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
and that's what I love about the homebrew process. And of course, I still buy kombucha from the store too, and I also make it myself.
Yeah.
Um, so I just think there's a nice overlap there, and it's not going to perfectly protect against everything. Nothing does.
Right. Yeah. But it is a pretty resilient system, which I think is really cool. And that's, a lot of what we're finding with our research is that it seems to have a bunch of mechanisms that allow it to basically keep it as a cooperative system despite the possibilities of invaders that would come in and exploit it.
Well, that's the other reason I love to drink it, because I feel like we're consuming the byproduct of a culture that's learned how to live in harmony. And when we put that into our bodies, and of course all the physiological benefits from consuming it, I just feel like there's, when you drink living water, when you eat living foods, there's just some other energy to it that is vital to humans, right? When we look at ultra processed foods, or, like the types of foods that might exist post apocalypse, because they have so many preservatives in them and therefore may not fully benefit our living organism. But there's just something about that feels really exciting and dynamic as someone who's continuing a tradition from generations, decades, hundreds, maybe thousands of years.
Yeah. Well, and the other cool thing about, consuming fermented foods is that, you are taking in, as you already alluded to, this community, right? That is already adapted to be cooperative, but through this chain, this like metabolic network, it's almost like a mini ecosystem where like the byproducts from this organism get processed by this one, and you have a sort of chain that emerges. And that means if you're consuming foods that have those microbes already, the sort of co-adapted community that can process food, that you're adding to your microbiome's ability to have a sort of complex process of breaking down foods from what you initially put in to what you get out. So that is going to add stability and diversity to your microbiome, which we know are both good things to add.
Absolutely. Well, this sounds amazing. I can't wait to come see the show when it's here in Los Angeles and support the amazing work you're doing. And I love the way you frame these concepts, and I think they make a lot of sense for these dynamic, changing times we're in. So let's just share one more time where people can learn about you, the book, and all the great work you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah. So my website is athenaactipis.org. You can go on there and see all of the things that I'm doing and have done. The book, A Field Guide to the Apocalypse, you can get that anywhere books are sold, including, major booksellers that I'm not going to mention, but it's up. It's up
everywhere. Books are sold.
Everywhere books are sold. It's also I am the voice for the audio version. So you can get that on Audible. And then the Apocalypse Roadshow, apocalypseroadshow.com. And we're on Instagram and Facebook as Apocalypse Roadshow. And just definitely reach out to me if you are interested in learning more, and none of those resources answer your questions. I've also have a bunch of papers about things relating to kombucha and cooperation, and my first book is about multicellular bodies as cooperative systems and what happens when that breaks down. That's called The Cheating Cell. So if you're interested in that, that's also, you can find more information about that on my website. Definitely reach out to me if you are interested in learning more, and none of those resources answer your questions. I've also have a bunch of papers about things relating to kombucha and cooperation, and my first book is about multicellular bodies as cooperative systems and what happens when that breaks down. That's called The Cheating Cell. So if you're interested in that, that's also, you can find more information about that on my website.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you today, Athena. Thanks so much for taking the time in your very busy schedule, and we'll look forward to chatting with you again another time.
Great. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.